The clock above the nurse's station glowed 2:13 a.m., that ghostly hour when hospitals feel less like places of medicine and more like gates between two worlds. At St. Gabriel's Medical Center, Chicago's oldest Catholic hospital, the night shift moved like a quiet river, doctors scribbling notes under fluorescent lights, nurses whispering updates at the ICU doors, and janitors sweeping hallways that smelled faintly of bleach and sorrow. The winter storm outside rattled the tall windows, draping the city in silence. Snow fell in heavy curtains, muffling even the distant sirens. Inside, room 417 was dim, lit only by a single lamp glowing near the bed where Margaret Hayes, age 62, lay dying. Margaret had been a nurse herself once, decades ago, before illness hollowed her lungs and stole her strength. She was a woman who had raised her daughter alone, who had cared for strangers more than she cared for herself. And now, the same hospital halls she had once walked as a healer echoed with her labored breaths. Beside her, Emily Hayes, her only child, sat in a grey chair with red eyes and trembling fingers. She'd been holding her mother's hand for hours, afraid that if she let go, the warmth would fade forever. "Mom," she whispered, "I'm right here. Please, don't leave me." The monitor by the bed emitted a slow, irregular beep, the sound that had become Emily's nightmare. Each pause felt like a cliff's edge, a soft knock at the door. "Miss Hayes," came a gentle voice. It was Yusuf Karim, the janitor. He looked about 40, with olive skin, deep-set eyes, and a quiet dignity that made him seem older than his years. His uniform bore faint water stains, his hands smelled faintly of disinfectant, and around his wrist was a worn bracelet of wooden prayer beads. He had cleaned this wing for years. He knew most of the nurses by name, most of the patients by their size. But something about this room tonight drew him in differently. Emily looked up weakly. "Yes?" Yusuf hesitated. "I'm sorry to disturb you. I was just checking the floor. Do you need some water? Or maybe a blanket?" Emily shook her head. "No, I just need my mom to breathe again." The words hung heavy in the air. Yusuf stepped inside quietly, his shoes making no sound on the linoleum. The light from the monitor flickered across his face, catching the faint glint of a tear that he quickly wiped away. He looked at Margaret. Her lips were pale, her chest rising only slightly beneath the thin hospital sheet. He had seen many patients like her, people who slipped away silently while the world moved on. But tonight, something inside him stirred, something that whispered, "Stay." He placed his cleaning cart aside and reached into his pocket. Out came a small, folded scarf, faded blue, the kind used for prayer. The edges were frayed, the fabric soft with time. It had belonged to his late wife, Amina, who had died 5 years earlier in the same hospital after a long fight with cancer. Every night since, Yusuf carried that scarf. It wasn't just a memory. It was his way of keeping her prayer alive. He looked at Emily. "May I?" he asked softly, holding up the scarf. Emily blinked through her tears, uncertain but too numb to object. "Yes, go ahead." Yusuf moved to the bedside. Margaret's eyelids fluttered, though her consciousness was slipping. Her forehead was damp with fever. He bent down slightly, his voice low and trembling. "Ya Rahman, Ya Shafi," he whispered, Arabic words meaning "O most merciful." "O healer." He gently wiped her forehead with the scarf, his hand steady despite the ache in his chest. And then something happened. It was faint at first, the smallest change in rhythm. The heart monitor, which had been erratic and weak, began to beep with a steadier pulse. Margaret's chest rose more deeply, her breath smoother. Emily noticed first. She leaned forward, blinking in disbelief. "Wait, what's happening?" she gasped. Yusuf looked at the monitor, then back at the woman. He said nothing. The nurse on duty, Samantha, rushed in, drawn by the sound of the changing tone. She frowned at the readings, adjusting the oxygen mask. "Her vitals are improving, but how?" Emily grabbed her hand, half crying, half laughing. She was fading. "I don't understand." The doctor on call was summoned, flipping through the chart, confusion written across his face. We didn't administer anything new, he murmured. This shouldn't be happening, but it was. Margaret's eyes fluttered open for a brief second. Her lips moved, dry, barely audible. Emily! Her daughter leaned close, tears streaming. Mum, I'm here. And then Margaret's frail hand, the same hand that had been limp for hours, rose slowly, just enough to touch Emily's cheek. I saw light, she whispered weakly. So bright. And warm. Her pulse, once fading, now beat firmly under her thin skin. The doctor ordered tests, nurses adjusted monitors, and chaos filled the quiet room. But Yusuf quietly stepped back toward the door, lowering his gaze. When Emily turned to thank him, he was already leaving. She called after him, her voice shaking. Wait, sir, what did you do? He paused at the doorway, the scarf still in his hand. Sometimes, he said softly, mercy travels through hands we don't expect. And with that, he slipped into the hallway, back into the world of mop buckets and quiet prayers, while behind him, a miracle bloomed under the watch of a midnight sky. Snow drifted past the windows. The city lights blurred in silver fog, and in room 417, a heartbeat that science had surrendered to faith found its rhythm once more. Morning broke slowly over Chicago, a pale sun pushing its way through the snow-clouded sky. The streets outside St. Gabriel's were slick with frost, and the sound of car tires over ice echoed faintly through the hospital corridors. Inside the ICU, everything looked the same as the night before. Monitors blinking, nurses pacing, and the steady chorus of machines that marked the line between life and death. Yet to those who had witnessed room 417 last night, the world suddenly felt different. The doctors were calling it a medical anomaly. The nurses were calling it a second chance. But to Yusuf Karim, the janitor who had wiped Margaret Hayes' forehead with his wife's scarf, it was simply Rama, mercy. He hadn't told anyone what he'd done. He'd spent the rest of the night cleaning stairwells and changing trash bags, trying to convince himself that maybe it was all coincidence, that science, not faith, had pulled her back from the edge. But deep down, Yusuf knew better. By the time his shift ended at 7 a.m., rumors had already begun to spread among the staff. Did you hear about room 417? One nurse whispered at the coffee machine. Patient was practically gone, another replied. And then, boom, vitals just stabilized out of nowhere. They laughed softly, shaking their heads. The way medical people often do when they can't explain something. But not everyone laughed. Dr. Henry Mallard, the hospital's chief of medicine, frowned when he saw the night reports. A seasoned man in his late 50s, with silver hair and a mind sharpened by decades of science, Henry did not believe in miracles. Coincidences are just data we don't yet understand, he often said. He entered the ICU that morning, scanning Margaret's chart. She was unresponsive at 1:45, he muttered. Oxygen saturation at 61%, heart rate 28, and by 2:18 she's breathing on her own. No new medication, no intervention logged. Emily, who had slept in the waiting chair all night, stood when she saw him. Her eyes were puffy, but alive with fragile hope. Doctor, she's better, right? She talked to me, Dr. Mallard sighed. She's stabilized for now, but this isn't how recovery works. Not after that kind of decline. Emily clasped her hands together. Then how do you explain it? He didn't answer. He just turned to the nurse and said, run another full panel. Let's see if we missed something. As the staff bustled around, Yusuf walked quietly past the ICU doors, heading for the maintenance room. His uniform smelled faintly of floor cleaner and detergent. He was exhausted but calm, until he heard someone call his name. Hey, Yusuf. It was Samantha, the night nurse. She jogged up to him with a curious smile. You were in 417 last night, right? He nodded slowly. For a moment, yes. Emily said you were praying when her mom started breathing again. Yusuf hesitated. I was asking for mercy. That's all, Samantha grinned. Well, whatever you did, maybe you should come to the ER more often. She laughed and patted his shoulder before hurrying off. But the words echoed in Yusuf's heart. Whatever you did. He hadn't done anything, had he? That afternoon, Emily stepped out of room 417 to find him cleaning near the vending machines. She approached carefully, her voice trembling. "Mr. Karim." He turned, surprised. "Yes, Miss Hayes. She stopped, her eyes glistening. "I don't know how to thank you. The doctors said my mom's condition was irreversible, but she's breathing, talking even. You were there when it happened. You touched her with that scarf, right?" Yusuf nodded gently, not meeting her gaze. "It's nothing special. Just an old piece of cloth." Emily shook her head. "Maybe to you. But last night when you wiped her forehead, I felt something in the room. Warmth, like the air changed." Yusuf smiled faintly. "When my wife was dying here, I prayed for her to stay. She didn't. But I learned something that night. Sometimes the answer to our prayers comes through someone else's pain. Maybe your mother's moment was her mercy." Emily didn't know what to say. She only knew that her mother was alive because of a man the hospital barely noticed. A janitor whose faith was stronger than any machine in that building. Later that day, Dr. Mallard summoned Emily into his office. The blinds were half closed, sunlight streaking across his desk. "Miss Hayes," he said seriously, "I've reviewed every test. There's no medical reason for your mother's recovery, none. It's unexplainable." Emily swallowed. "You mean—" "It's a miracle." The doctor's lips tightened. "I don't use that word. But whatever happened defies science." Outside the office, Yusuf stood by his cart, polishing the hallway floor. Through the glass window, he saw Emily clutching her mother's medical file and crying. Not from fear this time, but gratitude. That night when his shift ended, Yusuf went to the hospital chapel. It was empty, quiet, the stained glass windows catching the glow of the streetlights. He knelt at the back pew, holding the faded blue scarf. "Ya Allah," he whispered, "if you're using me for mercy, let me not fail." A gust of cold air slipped through the chapel doors. Somewhere deep in the hospital, a monitor beeped, steady and alive, and in room 417, Margaret Hayes slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, her hand resting over the place where Yusuf's scarf had touched her. The next morning dawned with a thin veil of mist hanging over the Chicago River, and the bell tower of St. Gabriel's chimed softly over the hospital grounds. For most, it was just another day. Doctors hurrying through rounds, nurses scribbling notes, the cafeteria buzzing with sleepy chatter and the scent of burnt coffee. But within the quiet walls of room 417, time itself felt suspended. Margaret Hayes, the woman everyone expected to die, sat upright in her bed, her eyes open, color slowly returning to her cheeks. She looked weak but alive. Her daughter Emily had not slept in 2 days. She sat by the bed holding her mother's frail hands, whispering stories from childhood, stories about the days when Margaret would pack lunches for nurses, too tired to eat, when she'd hum lullabies on night shifts, when Dr. Mallard entered with his clipboard, his professional mask faltered. "Mrs. Hayes," he said softly, "how are you feeling?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Hungry," she replied, her voice cracked but steady. "That must be a good sign." The doctor chuckled under his breath, but couldn't shake the disbelief clouding his mind. "Your vitals are better than they were in weeks. Your lungs, they're clearing up faster than expected." Emily clasped her hands in gratitude. "See, I told you, doctor, it's a miracle." Dr. Mallard sighed, looking over the report again. "Medicine doesn't deal in miracles, Miss Hayes. It deals in evidence." He turned to the nurse. "Schedule another CT scan. I want confirmation before we start rewriting her diagnosis." But as he walked out, he muttered under his breath, "Something about this isn't adding up." Down the hall, Yusuf Karim was pushing his mop bucket along the east corridor. The morning light bounced off the polished floors like water ripples. He looked tired, but his eyes were calm, the calm of a man who had already seen something beyond reason. Everywhere he went, people were talking about him. Not by name, no one knew the janitor's name, but by rumor. "That guy in 417, whispered a young nurse at the front desk. "They say he prayed over her." Another replied, "Oh, come on, that's superstition. She probably just got lucky." "Still," the first nurse said, "I've been here 5 years and never seen anyone come back from a crash like that." Yusuf overheard some of it. He didn't mind. Gossip was part of hospital life. But what made him uneasy was how quietly intense people's curiosity had become. Later that afternoon, as he was refilling his mop bucket, a woman in a black coat approached. She looked official, tall, poised, and holding a hospital badge that read Dr. Helena Crow, Medical Ethics Division. "Mr. Karim?" she asked politely. Yusuf froze, hand still on the mop handle. "Yes, ma'am. I'm conducting a review on the incident in room 417. I understand you were present the night Mrs. Hayes regained consciousness." He nodded slowly. "Yes, I was cleaning nearby." Dr. Crow tilted her head. "And during that time She flipped through her notepad, used a personal item, a scarf, to wipe her forehead. Yusuf hesitated. She was sweating. "I didn't mean any harm. The nurses were busy. I only wanted to help." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "The hospital has strict protocol about patient contact from non-medical staff. What you did could be considered a breach of hygiene policy." Yusuf's throat tightened. "I didn't think. I just saw a dying woman. Be that as it may," she said curtly, "you're not a medical practitioner. We can't allow personal belief or superstition to interfere with treatment." He lowered his gaze. "It wasn't superstition, ma'am. It was mercy." Dr. Crow sighed, tapping her pen on the clipboard. "We'll review the footage and decide what action to take. You may continue working until then." As she walked away, Yusuf's heart sank. He didn't care if people mocked him, but losing his job meant losing the only anchor he had left in this world. Meanwhile, word of the miracle patient had spread far beyond the hospital. Local journalists had caught wind of it. By evening, a reporter named Brian Keller from the Chicago Tribune showed up, pressing nurses for details. "Sources say a janitor was in the room when it happened," Brian said into his recorder. "Do you know his name?" No one answered. The hospital administration tried to hush the whispers, but it was too late. Within hours, a headline appeared online. "Unexplained recovery at St. Gabriel's. Faith or fluke?" The story went viral. Comments flooded in, some calling it divine intervention, others mocking it as pseudoscience. Emily saw the headline on her phone that night and felt a strange mixture of gratitude and fear. She hadn't meant to start a storm. But when people began asking about the man with the scarf, she realized Yusuf might be in trouble. She found him later that night in the hospital chapel again, sitting in silence before the flickering candles. The blue scarf lay folded in his lap. "Mr. Karim," she said softly, stepping closer. He turned, startled. "Miss Hayes, they're investigating you," she said. "The administration thinks you broke rules. But I told them. You saved my mother's life." He shook his head. "I saved no one. Healing doesn't come from these hands. It comes from the one who gave us hands to begin with." "But they don't see it that way," Emily said, her voice trembling. "They see risk, liability, scandal." "Please, let me help. I'll talk to them." Yusuf smiled gently. "If truth needs defending, it is not truth. Let them see for themselves." He stood, bowed his head slightly, and walked past her, a quiet figure disappearing into the sterile light of the hallways. As he left, Emily looked at the scarf resting on the pew. It fluttered slightly in the air, as though touched by a breeze that shouldn't have been there. Far above, in room 417, Margaret Hayes stirred in her sleep. Her lips moved faintly, whispering something, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a name, and in the deep silence that followed, the faint hum of the hospital blended with something unseen, the soft rhythm of faith breathing quietly against the noise of doubt. The storm that had gathered over St. Gabriel's Hospital was no longer the quiet one outside the windows. It was now within the walls. Rumors moved faster than stretchers. By the second morning, the story had spread from one department to another. Some said a janitor had healed a dying woman. Others whispered that a religious ritual had taken place in the ICU. The headlines on local TV ran bright and loud. "Miracle or misconduct? Hospital under review after unexplained recovery." It didn't matter that Yusuf Karim hadn't spoken to a single reporter. His silence was enough for people to invent their own versions of the truth. Inside the administration wing, hospital director Dr. Amanda Leighton sat in a conference room surrounded by nervous department heads. She looked tired. The kind of tired that comes from juggling reputation, science, and faith under one roof. Let's be clear, she said firmly, setting down her coffee cup. This hospital was built on compassion, but we operate on evidence. The media is turning us into a circus. Across the table, Dr. Henry Mallard nodded grimly. The moment you let one unverified event get labeled as a miracle, you lose all scientific credibility. We need to distance the hospital from this narrative immediately. Dr. Leighton tapped her pen. And the janitor? Mallard leaned back. He's at the center of it. Even if he meant no harm, his behavior was irregular. Using a personal cloth on a patient, no gloves, no authorization. It's a clear violation. But he saved her, said Dr. Evelyn Tran, a younger physician sitting quietly at the end of the table. We've all read the data. She was clinically collapsing. Then her vitals stabilized within minutes of his touch. We can't just dismiss that. Mallard's voice hardened. We also can't run a hospital based on folklore. Correlation isn't causation, Dr. Tran. Leighton sighed, rubbing her temple. Suspend him with pay until the investigation is over. We'll review security footage, file a statement for the press. And then she paused, lowering her tone. Pray the noise dies down. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Down in the janitor's quarters, Yusuf sat on a metal bench, staring at the folded scarf in his hands. His locker door was open, the few items inside revealing the life of a man who owned little. A thermos, a pocket Quran, and a faded photo of a woman smiling beside a lake. A knock came at the door. It was Emily Hayes. Clutching her coat, her face pale from worry. They've suspended you? She asked breathlessly. He nodded. Until they finish asking questions. That's ridiculous. Emily snapped. My mother is alive because of you. Why are they punishing you for that? Yusuf's eyes softened. People fear what they cannot measure. I don't blame them. Emily stepped closer, frustration trembling in her voice. Then let's prove it. Let's tell them what really happened. I'll testify. I'll tell every reporter. Yusuf raised a hand gently. Miss Hayes, faith doesn't need an audience. The more you chase truth for proof, the further it runs. She stared at him, tears filling her eyes. You sound like my mother. She used to say healing doesn't come from hospitals. It comes through them. He smiled faintly. Then your mother understands the language of mercy. But before Emily could answer, a nurse rushed down the hall. Miss Hayes! It's your mother. Her oxygen levels just dropped again. Room 417. Moments later, chaos filled the room once more. Alarms blared, nurses rushed in, and Dr. Tran was already shouting orders. Margaret Hayes' chest rose unevenly, her breath sharp and painful, blood pressure falling. Called a nurse. Pulse irregular! Dr. Tran pressed the stethoscope to her chest. She's going into arrest. Emily stood frozen near the wall, her body shaking. The world blurred. All she could hear was the sound of machines screaming her mother's name. Then, suddenly, amid the rush of footsteps, Yusuf appeared in the doorway. He shouldn't have been there. He was suspended, and security would soon come looking. But he couldn't stay away. He saw Emily's face, saw the terror, and stepped forward quietly. Let me try, he said. Dr. Tran turned sharply. You're not authorized to be in here. But Emily shouted, Please! Let him! For a brief second, chaos and silence collided. The room froze. Even Dr. Tran, caught between fear and faith, gave a single nod. Yusuf walked to the bed. Margaret's face was pale, her lips trembling as she gasped for air. Her pulse line dipped dangerously low. He took out the scarf again, now nearly colorless from age, and placed it gently on her chest. His voice was low, trembling, yet steady enough to fill the entire room. Ya Shafi, Ya Rahim. O healer, O merciful, let her heart remember your rhythm. The lights flickered. The sound of the monitor changed, not dramatically but gradually, like a hesitant drum learning to beat again. Then, impossibly, the pulse line rose. The heart monitor beeped once, twice, then steady. Dr. Tran stared in disbelief. The nurses froze. Emily collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Yusuf stood there, his hand trembling, tears glistening in his eyes. "Not my doing," he whispered. "Just his will." The door burst open. 2 security guards rushed in, followed by Dr. Mallard and Dr. Crow. "What's going on here?" Mallard barked. "He's not supposed to be here." Dr. Tran pointed to the monitor. "Look at the readings." Crow's face turned pale. "That's impossible." Mallard's voice broke the moment. "Remove him from this room, now!" The guard stepped forward, grabbing Yusuf by the arms. He didn't resist. He looked one last time at Margaret, breathing, alive again, and then at Emily, who whispered through her tears, "Thank you." As he was led away, he said softly, "Don't thank me. Thank the one who listens when no one else does." That night the city lights flickered outside like candles in the cold. Emily sat beside her mother, who now slept peacefully, color returning to her cheeks once again. In another part of the hospital, Yusuf sat in a small holding office, waiting for his final disciplinary meeting. He wasn't angry, wasn't afraid. His mind was elsewhere, on Amina, his late wife, and on the prayer they once shared together. "If mercy ever flows through me, let it find those who need it most." He closed his eyes, whispering those words again, unaware that in room 417, Margaret had just woken. She turned to Emily weakly and said, "The man with the scarf. I saw him in my dream. He was standing in a field of light." Emily held her mother's hand tightly, her voice trembling. "He's real, Mom, and they're trying to take him away." Margaret smiled faintly. "Then let the world see what faith looks like when science walks away." By dawn, the storm over Chicago had passed, but inside St. Gabriel's Medical Center, a different kind of storm was brewing. One made not of wind and snow, but of tension, questions, and headlines. For the second time in 72 hours, Margaret Hayes had been declared beyond saving, and for the second time, she had come back. The medical charts didn't make sense. The timelines didn't match. Every instrument, every machine, every clinical explanation broke down under one undeniable truth. The woman had revived only after a janitor's touch. The emergency board meeting at 8 a.m. The hospital's administrative board convened in the large oak-paneled conference room overlooking the snowy city. Reporters had already gathered outside the building, their cameras flashing as hospital employees hurried through the doors. Inside, the air was thick with unease. "Close the blinds," said Dr. Amanda Layton, the hospital director, her voice low but steady. She stood by the window, her sharp eyes scanning the faces before her. Physicians, lawyers, the ethics committee, and one frightened man sitting quietly at the end of the table, Yusuf Karim. He was still wearing his grey janitor's uniform, but the fabric was slightly damp from melted snow. In front of him sat a cup of untouched coffee. He looked neither guilty nor defensive, just calm, almost peaceful. Layton adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Karim, do you understand why you're here today?" "Yes, ma'am," Yusuf said softly. "You believe I broke hospital protocol?" "That's correct," said Dr. Crow, flipping through her notes. "You entered a restricted room during a critical emergency, handled a patient without authorization, and introduced an external item, a personal cloth, which may have contaminated sterile conditions." Yusuf nodded slowly. "I understand your concern." Crow's tone sharpened. "Do you deny touching Mrs. Hayes with your scarf?" He shook his head. "No, I did, but not to harm her." "Then why?" snapped Dr. Mallard, who had been silent until now. "Why interfere during a code blue situation? Are you claiming you can heal patients better than trained doctors?" Yusuf looked at him with steady eyes. "No, doctor. I only asked the healer to heal." The room fell silent. Layton cleared her throat. "Mr. Karim, this hospital respects every faith, but our work relies on science, not superstition. What happened in room 417, twice, cannot be verified. It may have been coincidence or emotional suggestion or even a recording error in our system." At that, Dr. Evelyn Tran, sitting 2 seats away, spoke up for the first time. Her voice was calm but edged with quiet conviction. "With respect, Director, I was there the second time. I saw Mrs. Hayes' pulse return the moment he placed his hand on her chest. There was no error. It was real. Mallard frowned. You're a doctor, Evelyn. You of all people should know better than to— I know what I saw, she cut in, her voice rising slightly. I've worked in emergency medicine for 15 years. I've seen miracles disguised as coincidence, but never one this direct. You can strip him of his badge, but you can't strip away what happened. Leighton sighed heavily. This isn't about belief, Dr. Tran. It's about liability. The hospital lawyer, a stern man with slicked-back hair, spoke next. The press is already calling this the miracle of St. Gabriel's. We're facing pressure from both religious groups and skeptics. If we don't handle this carefully, it could damage our credibility. Or worse, attract legal claims if others come expecting divine healing. He turned to Yusuf. Do you understand, Mr. Karim, that what you did could be seen as impersonating medical personnel? Yusuf smiled faintly. No one mistook me for a doctor. I only did what any man of faith would do when seeing another in pain. I prayed. Mallard leaned forward, exasperated. This is a hospital, not a mosque. Yusuf looked down at his hands, his voice quiet but clear. And yet, Doctor, we both serve the same purpose, to help the suffering live another day. No one spoke for a long moment. Leighton exhaled deeply. Mr. Karim, we're placing you on indefinite leave while we complete our investigation. You are not to enter any patient care areas during this time. Do you understand? Yusuf nodded. Yes, ma'am. The meeting adjourned. Papers shuffled. Chairs scraped. But as Yusuf stood to leave, Dr. Tran rose suddenly. Wait. Everyone turned to her. I want it on record, she said firmly, that I don't believe this man did anything wrong. Whatever science cannot explain, it must at least respect. That woman is alive because of him. Leighton's eyes softened, but her voice remained firm. Duly noted, Doctor. Later that day, the hallway outside the conference room was crowded with reporters. Yusuf stepped out quietly, trying to slip away unnoticed. But the moment someone shouted, "That's him!" microphones, cameras, and questions exploded around him. Sir, do you claim divine power? Are you a faith healer? Did you perform a religious act in a hospital ward? He raised a hand. Please, I am not what you think. What are you then? A journalist asked. Yusuf paused, looking directly into the nearest camera lens. His eyes were calm, but full of something larger than himself. I'm just a man who believes mercy can travel through anyone, even a janitor with a mop. The clip aired that evening on every major news channel. Within hours, social media was ablaze. The janitor of miracles. Faith at St. Gabriel's. When science failed, faith healed. Thousands of comments poured in, some calling him a saint, others branding him a fraud. Talk shows debated his miracle. The hospital released a cautious statement emphasizing that no supernatural explanation can be verified. But for Emily Hayes, sitting beside her mother in room 417, none of that mattered. She only knew her mother was alive. That night, a soft snow fell outside. The glow of the city lights made the flakes look like drifting stars. In the small apartment where Yusuf lived, a one-room space above a laundromat, he sat on the floor, surrounded by silence. The blue scarf lay before him, folded carefully beside a small framed photograph of his wife. He whispered quietly into the night, Ya Allah, if this was a test, let me face it with patience. A knock came at the door. When he opened it, he found Emily standing there, bundled in her coat, cheeks red from the cold. I found your address from the staff records, she said breathlessly. I had to see you. He gestured for her to come inside. My mother wants to see you, she said, her eyes shimmering. She says you appeared in her dream, not as a man, but as light. She wants to thank you before. She hesitated, her voice trembling. Before the doctors move her to long-term care. Yusuf smiled gently. You don't owe me thanks, Miss Hayes. But she insists, Emily said. Please, he nodded slowly. Tomorrow morning. As she turned to leave, she stopped at the door. They might fire you, she said softly. He smiled. If I lose my job for helping someone live, then perhaps I was hired for the wrong reason. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Dr. Mallard sat alone in his office, staring at the lab results spread before him. Every number confirmed what his mind refused to believe. Margaret Hayes' organs were regenerating faster than medically possible. He rubbed his eyes, whispering under his breath, "This shouldn't be happening." Then he noticed something, a faint trace on the ECG report. During the minute when Margaret's vitals had flatlined, a small, unexplained electrical spike had appeared, almost as if her heart had been shocked back into rhythm by an invisible defibrillator. Mallard leaned back slowly, his scientific certainty beginning to tremble under the weight of something he had never admitted to himself. Maybe there are forces we can't measure. He looked toward the window, where snow fell like quiet grace over the sleeping city, and for the first time in years, he whispered a word he hadn't spoken since his childhood: God. The world was divided over what had happened in room 417. Was it faith? Was it fate? But for those who had been there, Emily, Margaret, Dr. Tran, and even the skeptical Dr. Mallard, one truth was clear. Something unseen had moved through those sterile walls, something no machine could chart, and far from the noise of cameras and critics. Yusuf Karim, the janitor who prayed instead of prescribing, prepared to return to the hospital once more, not to defend himself but to say goodbye. Snow still blanketed the streets of Chicago when dawn broke over St. Gabriel's Medical Center once more. The city was quiet, the kind of quiet that seems to listen, as if even the wind was holding its breath. Inside the hospital, journalists had been cleared from the lobby. The security guards now stood double shift at the entrances. Cameras were no longer allowed inside, but curiosity still hovered like perfume in every corridor. Doctors whispered between rounds. Patients prayed more softly that morning. Something in the air had changed, and in room 417, Margaret Hayes was waiting. Her daughter Emily sat beside her, holding a bouquet of pale yellow lilies, her mother's favorite. Margaret's breathing was steady now. The oxygen mask had been removed. Her skin glowed faintly under the winter light seeping through the window. She turned her head toward her daughter. "Did he say he'd come?" Emily smiled. "He promised. He'll be here this morning." Margaret nodded slowly, eyes distant but peaceful. "When I was between life and death, I saw him standing in the light. He wasn't alone. There were others behind him, people I used to care for as a nurse, people who died in my arms long ago. They were all smiling. I think—" She paused. "I think mercy doesn't end when life does. It just finds another body to travel through." Emily's throat tightened. "Then maybe God sent his mercy through him." Margaret looked at her daughter, eyes full of something that felt both ancient and new. Maybe mercy doesn't need sending. Maybe it's already everywhere. It just waits for someone kind enough to carry it. Later that morning, the elevator doors opened on the 4th floor, and Yusuf Karim stepped out quietly. He was no longer wearing his janitor's uniform. Instead, he wore a simple grey coat, the kind of coat that had seen many winters. In his hand was the faded blue scarf, washed, folded, and tied carefully with a piece of twine. He walked past the nurses' station, heads turned. Conversations hushed. Some nodded respectfully. Others looked away, uneasy. Dr. Evelyn Tran was the first to meet him in the hallway. "They told me you were coming," she said softly. "They're still debating your case." He smiled faintly. "Let them. I only came to see someone." Dr. Tran hesitated, then said quietly, "You know, Mr. Karim, since that night I haven't stopped thinking. I used to believe medicine could explain everything, but now, when I hold a patient's hand, I pray silently before I act. Maybe that's what I was missing all along." Yusuf nodded gently. "Prayer doesn't compete with medicine, doctor. It completes it." Her eyes glistened. "I believe that now." He placed a hand over his heart in gratitude and continued toward room 417. When he entered, the air inside felt still, like the pause before a hymn. Margaret Hayes looked up, and a fragile smile broke across her face. "I knew you'd come," she said. Yusuf bowed slightly. "I couldn't leave without seeing you well." Emily stood, her voice trembling. "Mr. Karim, the hospital doesn't deserve you. The world doesn't either. But we needed you," he smiled. "The world always needs mercy, Miss Hayes. Sometimes it forgets." He walked closer to the bedside. Margaret reached out a trembling hand, and he took it gently in his own. "I don't remember everything," she said, "but I remember warmth, not like fire, but like sunlight after winter." And a voice saying, "Not yet." "Was that you?" Yusuf shook his head. "No, ma'am. That voice never comes from me." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Then tell me, why me? Why save me when so many others die?" Yusuf's gaze softened, his words low and steady. "Because your daughter needed faith again. Because your doctor needed doubt. Because someone in that hospital hallway needed to remember that compassion is the highest science. Sometimes a single heartbeat saves more souls than 1,000 sermons." Silence filled the room, not empty silence, but the kind that feels sacred. Then Margaret said, "May I hold that scarf?" He nodded and handed it to her. The fabric trembled in her hands as she pressed it against her heart. "This isn't just cloth," she whispered. "It's a bridge." Outside the room, as Yusuf left, he found himself face to face with Dr. Henry Mallard, the skeptic, the scientist, the man who had called his faith superstition. Mallard's face looked older now, as if sleepless nights had carved new lines around his eyes. He held a stack of reports in one hand, scans, charts, numbers, but his gaze was fixed on Yusuf. "Mr. Karim," he began awkwardly, "I owe you an apology." Yusuf smiled gently. "For what, doctor?" "For being afraid of what I couldn't explain." Mallard's voice broke slightly. "All my life I've treated miracles like viruses, things to isolate and study until they lose their mystery. But that night, I saw something that medicine can't chart. I've spent decades healing bodies, but I forgot to heal souls. You reminded me." He looked down at the reports, shaking his head. "Her lungs are regenerating tissue that shouldn't exist. Her scans look like they belong to someone 20 years younger. Every logical path ends in a wall. And for once, I'm glad I can't climb it." Yusuf placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "When knowledge reaches its limit, faith begins. They were never meant to be enemies." Mallard nodded slowly, eyes glassy. "You're right. And for what it's worth, I'll make sure they don't fire you. This hospital needs its janitor of miracles." Yusuf chuckled softly. "I'm no miracle worker, doctor. Just a man with a mop and a prayer." Mallard smiled. "Then maybe that's exactly what we've been missing." 2 weeks later, the world outside had moved on to new headlines. But St. Gabriel's had changed quietly. Margaret Hayes was discharged, walking slowly but proudly out of the hospital doors with her daughter at her side. Nurses lined the hallway, some clapping, some crying. Dr. Tran slipped her a note with a smile. "Some cures begin where science ends." Outside the entrance, reporters waited, but Emily waved them away. "No interviews," she said. "Some miracles aren't meant to be broadcast." Margaret turned once more toward the hospital windows, whispering softly, "Thank you, whoever you were." Inside, Yusuf watched from afar, standing by the janitorial closet where his cleaning cart waited. He didn't step forward. He didn't need to. He only smiled and whispered, "Alhamdulillah." Months later, spring arrived. The snow melted from the city's shoulders, revealing streets and gardens alive again. St. Gabriel's Hospital looked brighter that season, not because of renovations, but because of the quiet change that had settled in its halls. Doctors who once laughed at prayer now paused for silence before surgeries. Nurses who once hurried past the chapel now stopped inside for a minute or two each morning. In the janitor's closet, Yusuf's old uniform still hung neatly on its hook. The locker beneath it was empty, except for one thing. Inside, folded with care, lay the faded blue scarf and a small handwritten note. "For whoever cleans these floors after me, remember, healing begins where kindness touches first." No one knew where Yusuf went after leaving St. Gabriel's. Some said he returned to Dearborn to live quietly near his family. Others claimed he went overseas to volunteer in refugee clinics. But sometimes, late at night, when the hospital was silent and the wind rustled through the chapel windows, A few nurses swore they heard the faint sound of footsteps, slow, steady and gentle, as if someone were still cleaning the floors, whispering prayers between the echoes of life and loss. Epilogue: a year later, St. Gabriel's installed a small plaque in the East Corridor, the one that led to room 417. It bore no photograph, no official title, only a few simple words. In memory of the mercy that healed where science failed, may compassion remain our greatest medicine. Visitors still pause there sometimes, tracing the engraved letters with their fingers. Some say the air feels warmer near that wall. Some say it's imagination. But those who believe simply smile, because in a world that builds walls between knowledge and faith, there will always be one story about a janitor, a scarf, and a dying woman who lived that quietly reminds humanity when science failed, faith healed, and mercy never left.